this day. We thank you for all the blessings that you've given to us and to this country. God, we just ask you now to fill us with your Holy Spirit and help us to keep our eyes on you. Help us not to look to the left or to the right, but only to you. And so, Lord, I ask you now to bless this congregation, bless those who have tuned in with us today, and bless our country. So, Lord, I ask you that these words be yours and not mine. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. Okay, a priest spoke for 20 minutes. He spoke on Isaiah, 20 minutes on Ezekiel, 20 minutes on Jeremiah, and 20 minutes on Daniel. Then he said, we come now to the 12 minor prophets. So what place should I give Hosea? So the man in the back row shouted, I'm leaving, give Hosea my place. So in our gospel lesson today, Jesus talks about yokes and not egg yolks. He talks about yokes. And a yoke is a work tool. It was an important part of the workplace during that time. A yoke was a piece of wood that a farmer placed across the necks of oxen to enable them to work together to pull a plow. The yoke spanned the necks of 2 oxen so they could combine their pulling power. A load that would be too much for 1 ox would be a piece of cake for 2. But a lot depended on the farmer. How did he treat the oxen? Did he ram the plow deeply to the ground? Did he load the cart too heavily? Did he use a whip? And a lot depended on the yoke. A too heavy yoke would add to the burden. A badly fitted yoke would rub the oxen's necks raw. And some carpenters, they had a special talent for making yokes. And if an ox could pray, it would pray for a talented yoke maker. Someone with an eye for the contours of an ox's shoulder. Someone who could judge how much space to leave between the neck pieces. The ox would pray for a yoke maker who would take the time to fit the yoke well and who would polish the wood and would sand the splinters off. And you know, these things we wear, these what they call stoles, they're also known as yokes. We take on the yoke of Jesus Christ. And so I remember when I was ordained, Bishop Firestone took my stole or yoke and pulled real heavily on it. Because he knew I needed to be tamed.
Amen.
And we know that Joseph was a carpenter. And so he would have been teaching Jesus the art of carpentry as soon as Jesus was old enough to hold a tool. And as Jesus grew, he would learn a little more each day. And at some point, Jesus too would become a master carpenter. And there's a legend about Jesus. According to the legend, Jesus carved excellent yokes. And according to the legend, people came from near and far to buy yokes from Jesus. It was worth their while to seek out Jesus because a Jesus yoke would wear comfortably all day. A Jesus yoke would enable oxen to do more work and to do it more happily. It's just a legend. But it could be true because Jesus spoke to the people he would explain things in ways that they could relate to. We know that Joseph was a carpenter. We know that he would have taught Jesus his trade. It's likely that as a carpenter, Jesus would have made ox yokes. And if he did, I'm sure that he made them well. There'll probably be something to those yokes. But in our gospel lesson today, Jesus spoke of yokes for people, not oxen. And he said, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavily burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." And you know, the rabbis sometimes spoke of God's law as a yoke for the people to bear. But you know, God intended the law to be comfortable. And some people found it comfortable because the psalmist in Psalm 19:7 says that Yahweh's law is perfect, restoring the soul. Yahweh's testimony is sure, making wise the simple. Yahweh's ordinances are true and righteous altogether. And here's what the psalmist meant. He meant that we can trust God's law. He meant that God's law is a faithful guide. He meant that even a not very bright person could get along just fine by following God's law. But in the hands of the rabbis, the laws had become a heavy burden. For instance, the rabbis took a simple law such as don't work on the Sabbath. And by the time they were through with it, you needed a PhD to figure out what you could and couldn't do. The rabbis wrote one big book after another explaining every jot and tittle of the law. They said, you have to know all these things to keep God's law. You have to do all these things to keep God happy. And the people despaired because nobody could do all those things. But if the rabbis had a talent for making life complicated, Jesus had a talent for making it simple. The rabbi said you have to know everything in these books we've written. But Jesus in Matthew 7:12, he says, "In everything do to others as you would have them do to you. For this is the law and the prophets." And when Jesus said this is the law and the prophets, he meant that's all you need to know. Just do to others you would have them do to you. And that covers all the bases. His summary of the law was, in everything do to others as you would have them do to you. How more simple can that be? And when a lawyer asked Jesus what was the most important commandment, he said there are two important commandments. Love God, love your neighbor. He said on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So what Jesus meant was this. He meant love God and love your neighbor. That's all you need to know. And that's all you need to do. How could it get more simpler than that? Because you don't need a PhD in Jewish law to please God. You just have to love God. You just have to love your neighbor. 1, 2. And as young people would say, duh. Or as I would say, see. In other words, it's obvious. On April 11th, 1970, Apollo 13. Who remembers Apollo 13? Well, I'm going to tell you the story about it. Apollo 13 launched on its journey to the moon, but 2 days later the mission had to be aborted because of an explosion. The astronauts had to move to the lunar module to use it as a lifeboat. They had to shut down power in the command module to conserve its batteries for re-entry. There are a lot of problems to solve if they wanted to save that crew. One problem was how to steer when firing the lunar module engine for a course correction. They finally decided that their best hope was to look through the window at a fixed object in space, steering to keep that object always in view. If they could keep that object in view, they had a chance of getting home. And so the object they chose was planet Earth. Jim Lovell, he sat at the window, and as the rocket fired, he did his best to steer so he could see the Earth. And he succeeded. And the astronauts eventually made it safely back to planet Earth. And that's a lot like our task as Christians. We need to keep Jesus always in view as we go through life. We need to let him guide us in the right direction. When we learn to do that, our troubles will drop away and we will find rest for our souls. And so how could he make it more simpler than that? You know, lots of people want to make the Christian life very complicated. They're like the rabbis of Jesus' day. They want to make us jump through lots of hoops. They want to impose a lot of rules. But that's not what Jesus said. And you know what? Being a Christian, it isn't always easy. Far from it. But the rules in the Jesus kingdom are simple. Keep your eyes on Jesus. Come to Jesus and learn from him. And then you will find rest for your soul. So, since we're celebrating our country's independence this weekend, I'd like to read this passage from Paul's letter to the Galatians. And I'd like us to reflect on it. And it's Galatians 5:13 through 15. For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another. I didn't say this. Paul said this many years ago. And you know, the 4th of July is our big annual party. And it's a huge celebration that unites us as people. And we celebrate usually with hot dogs and drinks and sparklers and flags, concerts in the parks, fireworks, speeches, and parades. And we're going to go back to that eventually. So we should wonder how many people have any real idea of what it is we're celebrating. I laugh, but I don't laugh. Anybody ever see Water's World when he goes out and asks those questions out to people and asks them, do you know why you're celebrating this? And you get some pretty interesting answers. The picture of us as Americans is not always a pretty picture either. You know the statistics: half of marriages ending in divorce, 40% of all children born out of wedlock, more citizens in jail than in Europe, alcoholism and drug use at an all-time high. And you can read or hear equally strong criticism of us as individuals and a society from academics and preachers right and left. So what's to celebrate? In my experience, Americans as a people are more self-critical than most nations. And I suspect it comes from our religious tradition. We hold ourselves to higher standards than most other countries, including the nations of Western Europe, and equally important, we feel free to do it. Today we find ourselves with a lack of civility. That's very unfortunate for a supposedly civilized people. Regardless of that, regardless of what's going on, there was a survey by the University of Chicago's National Opinion Research Center, and 75% of Americans agreed with the statement, "I'd rather be a citizen of my country than of any other." But only 21% of Germans, 34% of Frenchmen, and 21% of Spaniards said they'd rather be a citizen of their country than any other. You know, someone has said, granted that there's no perfect people or system, but watch the direction that people run when they're given the opportunity. You know, Father was talking with his rebellious son one day and said, every person who lives in the United States is a privileged person. The boy answered, "I disagree with you, Dad." And the father replied, "That's the privilege. That's the privilege." Just think of the countries of this world, most of them, where that privilege doesn't even exist. Criticism or complaint will land you in jail or dead or a bullet. And that's what the founders fought and died for long ago. And it's a miracle of providence that such a band of men, learned, brave, thoughtful, united around the conviction that it was possible to build a society not with a king, but by the consent of the people, who covenant with one another to live as one nation. And it was a radical idea at the time, breaking with the order that was thought to be natural and God ordained in most every other land. So our country was born not out of an accident, not out of ethnic tribe, not out of national history, but of a radical idea. And this good idea, it was by no means fully accepted at the time, no matter what the Declaration said. At least 1/4 of the colonists remained neutral to the idea. 1/4 remained loyal to the crown. And check this out, 40,000 of them migrated to Canada. So it was very much an experiment, this government by the people, and it presented those who put it forth the possibility of loss to their lives. 56 men signed the Declaration of Independence. Their convictions resulted in untold sufferings for themselves and for their families. Of the men, 5, they were captured by British and tortured before they died, and had their homes ransacked and burned. 2 lost their sons in the Revolutionary Army, and another had 2 sons captured. And 9 of the 56 fought and died from wounds or hardships of the war. Carter Braxton of Virginia, a wealthy planter and trader, saw his ship sunk by the British Navy. He sold his home and properties to pay his debts and died a pauper. At the Battle of Yorktown, the British General Cornwallis had taken Thomas Nelson's home for his headquarters, and Nelson quietly ordered General Washington to open fire on his home. The home was destroyed, and Nelson died bankrupt. John Hart was driven from his wife's bedside as she was dying. The 13 children fled for their lives. His fields and mill were destroyed. Over a year he lived in the forest and caves, returning home only to find his wife dead and his children vanished. And a few weeks later, he died from exhaustion. Was it worth it? Such death in the name of an ideal of a free people. Was it worth it? Was it worth it that any or all of the other wars that have come our way? Was it worth it? Young men and women placing the call of country above the desire to live. All these we remember this weekend. So was it worth it? It all depends. It remains an open question. Because they died for more than a freedom from far-off King George. They died for a future in which their people would be free to govern themselves in lives of moral purpose and hope. Professor Alexander Tytler, at the end of the 18th century, wrote a book entitled The Decline and Fall of the Athenian Republic. He insisted that ancient democracies waned under the selfishness of human hearts. He said these nations progressed through the following sequence: from bondage to spiritual faith, from spiritual faith to great courage, from courage to liberty, from liberty to abundance, from abundance to selfishness, from selfishness to complacency, and from complacency to apathy, and from apathy to dependency, and from dependency back to bondage, right where they first were, right where they started. So there's been a running and rather abstract argument in recent years among the right and left as to whether the Founding Fathers were real Christians or deists or agnostics. And here's the reality: that they all seemed overwhelmingly concerned that the American people have faith that would enable them the discipline and integrity to live harmonious. Because that's what counts. We're all broken people. 56 men who signed. We're all broken people. Every single one of us are broken people. But what are our fruits? That's what counts. Because if we look at what people were like, none of us should be here. None of us. I shouldn't be here, for sure. And they also recognize the risk in breaking loose from the monarchical system, the risk of reaping chaos, anarchy, and debauchery among the citizens when they did this. Something the French learned not too long after our revolution. It didn't go well for them. So George Washington, in his farewell address at Francis Tavern, which Laurie and I were able to go to, this is what he said to his troops on his farewell address. Do not let anyone claim the tribute of American patriotism if they even attempt to remove religion from politics. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality prevail in exclusion of religious principle. Religious principle. And John Adams said this: "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for government of any other." So Thomas Jefferson and Ben Franklin and many others, a century later, Tocqueville, visit us from France and came to this conclusion: America is great because America is good. And if America ever causes to be good, America will cease to be great. Georgianne Dyer, columnist, and definitely no ideologue, but most forcibly, she put it a few years ago: "I have come to the conclusion that it's impossible to have a moral community or nation without faith in God. Because without it, everything rapidly comes down to me, and me alone is meaningless." Today, many Americans have stopped acting in terms of their own moral, ethical, and religious beliefs and principles. They've stopped acting on what they knew was right. And the me has become the measure of everything. However, moral societies are the only ones that work. If anyone thinks that there's no direct and invaluable relationship between personal integrity in a society and that society's prosperity, that person has simply not studied history. And it shouldn't surprise us. Because great moral societies built on faith in God, honor, trust, and the law blossom because they are harmonious. Because people love or at least respect their fellow citizens. Because finally they have a common belief in something beyond themselves. It simplifies life immensely, and you do not waste and spend your days fighting for turf, for privilege, for money and power over your fellow citizens. So today, there's a concern among many for freedom of religion, and as only religion freely chosen is likely to shape the personal character and morality of its people. We became a country where religious faith could flourish because all forms and persuasions were tolerated and encouraged. And there are those secularists today who argue that our liberty also means the possibility of freedom from religion. And I agree, because they have that right. They have that right. This, however, doesn't answer the question as to what happens to a society where a significant majority exercise that right. The secularist operates with the naive assumption that if you encourage flight from religious commitment, you will not breed a populace that is out of control. And the biblical view of human nature, it sees it differently. So let me take you back to what the Apostle Paul wrote to the Galatians once again. For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If, however, you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another. You know, some kids were shown a model of the Statue of Liberty and were asked, what is she doing? What is she doing? And the little girl said, she's taking a shower. Another commented, she's raising her hand because she knows the right answer. But she knows the right answer because she has a Bible in the other hand. Freedom needs the constraint of religion, and it needs not only constraint, but optimism, hope, and the willingness to believe in the future. Compared to our European friends, we remain an optimistic people. Enshrined in our system is the equality which opens up possibilities of personal progress and upward mobility, which more class-structured societies lack. You know, we might have our problems, but I want you to look at other countries. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's taken us a couple of centuries to begin to get the definition of all. But the reality is that we are one of the most productive, energetic, and creative people. We have a long way to go in opening up future hope for everybody. But this is the experiment. This is our hope, that we continue to be better people as we go and follow what our founders gave to us. And we've not learned how to well educate everyone yet, which is especially important for a future in this sophisticated high-tech society. But think of the many Islamic countries where half the population is secluded in burqas and without education. Think of the masses of lower classes in India and even in Western Europe. There are cultural and educational barriers to advancement for many. You know, God has blessed this country, and He will continue to bless this country as long as we remember who blessed this country. Amen.